Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy today to be joined again by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. Welcome back, Josh.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, it's good to have you back. It was good to give you a break. We've had some interesting guests in the interim.
I didn't think I was going to get invited back.
It's been a pretty good run, but today, including today.
Okay, we'll see.
All right. So Josh and I have talked about a couple things. I think today's point of departure, at least, is something that really struck me last week. And Josh, I still can't decide if I'm just obsessed with this or what, to be perfectly honest with you.
Well, I was going to say, when you read the tea leaves for a living. We'll see.
Horse before the cart here. So today's point of departure, 2 proclamations last week from Governor Abbott's office. I mean, there were a few last week related to, the usual range of things, but 2 really stuck out to me. And I should give the hat tip to my wife who pointed this out to me, actually. Governor Abbott issued 2 proclamations last week that didn't get a lot of press attention. And by not a lot, I haven't Googled in the last day, but I think none.
I mean, it certainly seems close. It's a big state.
Yeah.
A lot of press outlets, but it's not something. It also, there was no packed journalism around this. It wasn't like something started and then you see an article.
Right. Somebody, and again, I think I put this in the mailing we sent out last week. I guess I should say that. I mentioned this in the mailing that we try to do once a week last week. And if you want to sign up for that, you can go up to our website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. There are all of our blog posts have a sign up form at the bottom for this list.
Or just email one of us.
Right.
We'll put you on there.
But I've said, hey, if I'm wrong about this and some of you have covered this, there's a lot of reporters on the list. So somebody has, send me an email. And, I had the usual open rate and didn't hear from anybody.
I don't think you said what this is yet, though.
So
what is the this?
This are 2 proclamations that the governor issued that renewed his emergency powers in 2 areas, on the COVID-19 pandemic and on the border crisis. And, one might say, what do you mean by the border crisis? And the declaration, to quote the declaration, he renews the disaster proclamation that he initially issued, I believe, in May of 2021, saying that, quote, the surge of individuals unlawfully crossing the Texas-Mexico border posed an ongoing and imminent threat of disaster for a number of Texas counties and for all state agencies affected by the disaster. And then there's the usual whereases.
Right.
So the pair, COVID and the border, are interesting. Now, anybody who follows Texas politics or certainly is listening to this is kind of saying, are you really surprised that he renewed the crisis on the border? And we'll roll around back to that. I mean, and I think it's a little more straightforward perhaps. But let's start with COVID. So as long as we're reading verbatim, the declaration says that the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, poses an imminent threat of disaster for all counties in the state of Texas. Now, the timing of this is interesting, given that it comes as the state is experiencing the lowest number of cases since the beginning of the pandemic, and nationally.
Along with the country, right?
Right. Nationally, we're seeing a scaling back.
Right. So, I mean, if anything, it's an interesting, I like this in policy. Everyone says, well, the plain text of this is, undeniable. And it's like, yeah, exactly. Right. So it poses an imminent threat in Texas. Yet, if anything, we're at probably the safest place we've been in as a state since really what?
The beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
or shortly before.
Right.
And actually, even then, it was probably more imminent than it is now.
And if you think about what also happened last week, right, or it was either last week or the week before, that was when the CDC revised its guidelines and started thinking about how we might think about scaling back a lot of the social distancing guidelines within counties, depending on how the counties were faring against the pandemic. Most counties in Texas have have done that. I mean, even here, we're in Travis County, which is certainly considered, an outlier in Texas. And even in Travis County, most of the restrictions have been lifted at this point.
Right.
So I
keep walking into places in Austin where there's a sign saying, we really would prefer you to wear a mask, and then you open the door and nobody's wearing a mask.
Not even the employees.
Yeah. Although the employees in a lot of places are the last holdouts, I think.
Another topic for another day, yes. I think. But yes. So, we see this. So we can back this up, right? So this is, our felt experience. We can look at the national data. We can look at the Texas state data on COVID, but then we can also look at all of our polling data, because obviously we've been asking public attitudes about COVID going back to the beginning of the very beginning of the pandemic. So I think we have about maybe almost 10 measures at this point going through the last couple of years on this. And I should say, so our most recent poll was in February. So to the extent when you hear any of these numbers, I would actually say they're probably even more positive today than when we last measured them, because I think there's been a pretty, precipitous decline, I would say both, in cases recently, but also in terms of mandates and various restrictions.
I mean, almost any indicator you look at, that we were looking at all along, cases, hospitalizations, but also, new vaccination rate.
Well, yes. So, okay, so what do we find? Well, at least in the February poll, 41% of Texans, almost half, are living their lives normally. We say, in response to the pandemic, are you living your life normally, coming and going usual? Are you being a little more careful? And then, or are you kind of restricting your movements? 41% in February say they're living normally. A year ago, it was 24%. Only 17% are seriously curtailing their behavior. A year ago, it was twice that. It was 34%. And so this is the sort of thing we're talking about. A lot of people in Texas are kind of living their lives. 43% are still concerned about the spread of COVID in their community, but this is down from 66% at the start of the pandemic, and it's likely lower now. Now, the thing is, and this is kind of where it gets a little bit weirder, right? But the partisan dynamics are still there, right? So when we look at that community spread concern, 60% of Democrats are still either somewhat or very, or I think extremely or very concerned about the spread of COVID in their community. It's 18% of Republicans. And that will hold across whatever item we look at here. So if we're saying 41% are living normally, it's, I'd have to go back and look again, but it's probably closer to 60% of Republicans. I'm pretty sure it's about at least that high. It's probably closer to 30% of Democrats, right? So ultimately, this has been a feature of the pandemic. It's been a feature of, I would say the public response to the pandemic is that there's basically, depending on what your political beliefs are, the pandemic has been a different experience, right? But even having said all that, it's interesting at a point when it feels like we're taking a step out of the pandemic that the governor is now saying this is an imminent threat in every, county in Texas, given the fact that the governor has basically just spent the last number of months successfully winning his Republican primary when the chief criticism against him was taking the pandemic too seriously
early on. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that, we've characterized the governor's response a lot in here, in print, and talking, whatever.
Right.
And I do think that, the overall characterization that I think we've both settled on is pretty fair, which is, beyond after the early months of the pandemic, when you saw generated a loud, and our data shows not trivial, but certainly not a majority of any group, really, other than maybe extreme conservatives. But even then, as I recall, that was more plurality territory. There was a loud pushback that characterized the governor's response as, too authoritarian, too disrespectful of liberty. And it did seem like those criticisms landed.
Yeah, I mean,
and were internalized. Now, that happened in the context of a national political environment in which Donald Trump was still president and was going out of his way to downplay the severity of the virus or to use it to blame other people, even after he got it.
Right. And so when you see this disaster declaration, I mean, I think it's very, I don't know, what's this? It's really easy, I think, to have a gut reaction to this. And I think we kind of avoid the gut reaction and kind of think, well, what are the possible range?
I'm always trying to respect them. I think I still had it.
No, I mean, listen, I'll say this. Gut reactions, extremely important, extremely informative. It doesn't mean they're right, but they're informative. Now, but then I think what we do as people who study public opinion for a living is try to take a step back and say, well, what is the range of potential reactions that you could have to this? And on the one hand, you kind of look at this discussion we're talking about, and you say, well, this is odd. I mean, he's basically, the governor's basically spent, once sort of the political dynamics got set in stone, he spent most of the pandemic downplaying its seriousness for the most part, I would say.
And I think if you were going to do a Google News search right now saying Greg Abbott and COVID-19 response, you wouldn't find very much in the last year.
Right. I mean, really, well, I think the thing you might find is
other than criticizing the overreaction of others.
Well, I would say in the real way, what you would find something, just to be fair, is, I think you would probably find some of the surge responses in certain areas of the state that the state has had to take a hand in, either because the localities were overwhelmed or because the optics of it were so terrible, like prisoners loading bodies into, trucks.
But even that was a while ago, right?
That was a while ago. So, on the one hand, you could say, well, wait a minute, like, the governor's mostly been downplaying the seriousness of the pandemic. Or I'll say this. Let me rephrase that. Let me be more careful. I'll say it this way, even though it's already recorded. But he's been prioritizing individual liberty over the public health response when weighted against each other. Let's say that way. So this isn't odd. He spent most of the last, kind of, let's say 6 or 8 months leading up to the Republican primary, basically trying to fight off this criticism that he has been too heavy-handed with his response. But then you could also be a Democrat sitting here saying, oh, so he admits that it is.
But right. And I would still argue that he fought off that response by just not talking about it very much and by pretty much ignoring the criticism or trying to change the subject in other directions.
Yeah, I would say he addressed it pretty aggressively initially, right? So if you think about the whole Shelley Luther incident and the we'll come back to this term later, but the flip-flop on kind of business restrictions, what have you, he responded extremely quick to the criticism, which is why...
But again, that was a while ago.
That was a long time ago. But that's the whole thing.
Political time.
Well, but this is the whole thing. But then you're bringing up another reaction, which is to say, didn't the governor, kind of make his bet on this, like a year and a half ago? So why are we now extending... Why would you
renew it based on all this? So we're basically elaborating our the gut response that's out there. But I think you're right. It's interesting. Not just in terms of how you respecting gut responses in terms of thinking about how one processes things in public opinion, but also in terms of the coverage. And I think that's honestly another reason why I'm surprised that nobody jumped on this.
As we talk
from a reporting kind of public discussion, or even the Democrats, right?
Yeah, it seems to me it'd be pretty easy for a reporter to go out and find some pretty divergent quotes and reactions to the disaster declaration. I'd be curious to know. It doesn't. I'm not real. I say this and I don't mean it, but it's I'd be kind of curious to know what Don Huffines thinks about the renewal of the disaster declaration. For example,
I'm tempted to put curious in quotes there, but okay.
Well, no, you can put curious.
I hear what you're saying.
No, you can put curious, but I'll rephrase this way. For a lot of the dissident groups who were supporting, more extreme candidates, both for governor and in the other Republican primaries. Interesting that that we haven't heard much about this, that the governor is continuing to move forward. Maybe the fight's over, they've lost, and they're packing up and moving on to the next battle. Right. But it does sort of raise this issue, generally of, in some ways, why did the governor choose to do this, given the fact that it's not clear exactly what the outcome of extending the declaration is going to be in a political sense.
Now, since they haven't said anything, I don't want to put words in the governor's team's mouths. But,
no.
But to play, to sort of give a fair shake here. Would also point out, article in the Washington Post this morning that had its own set of subtexts, but pointing out that, 3 or 4 people in the president's direct orbit have had to drop out of contact with the president in the last couple of weeks because they contracted COVID.
Yeah,
including his main spokesperson, Jen Psaki, who didn't accompany him on the European trip. Arguably one of the more important trips he's taken thus far in his presidency. Not even very arguably, though.
No, yeah.
And we're also there are last couple of days FDA said another booster's fine for a lot of people.
Right.
And parts of China are undergoing complete shutdowns.
Right.
There's a surge of another, Omicron subvariant in parts of Europe. So, I think if pressed on this, I suspect that the governor's message was like, obviously, we're being cautious.
Yeah.
And, We're not going to overreact like others will, but we are certainly going to keep our options open. And I think that is a perfectly reasonable response. Doesn't say any of the things we've been saying so far are not operative.
Right. Well, there's something else that we haven't mentioned here that I think is also important is you have to think about the counterfactual here, right? Let's say he lets the emergency order lapse or expire or whatever, right?
And we get another surge.
Well, even before we get another surge, I mean, I think there's an aspect to this which
there's a policy and a political.
Yeah, here's where I think the political aspect comes in, because then which is to say, we were talking about this briefly at some point where it's like, it brings up the like mission accomplished George W. Bush kind of banner, which is like, okay, COVID's no longer an emergency, and it's like, yeah, but based on all the things you just said, it could be in a couple of weeks, could be in a couple months, could be in a year, whatever. And ultimately, anything that sort of allows, anything that would position the governor, I think, at this point to be saying, nope, mission accomplished, we've taken care of this, would be unnecessarily risky. And maybe that's part of it, too.
Not the kind of gamble that they take.
Definitely not the type of gamble they take. They're very, I'll say this, they're thoughtful about their risk calculations.
Right. Which is one of the overarching themes here. And, as long as we're talking about the politics at this point, also, I think maintaining the status quo in an election year on something like this, at a press conference, I could see, if they were to have a press conference, it would be a fair question to say, oh, so you think that the Biden administration has succeeded in one of its goals of of managing COVID-19 and the pandemic? No Republican candidate wants to answer that question right now. So a low-key, so there are reasons for a low-key kind of approach to this that they've taken. Go ahead and quietly renew this, see what kind of questions get asked or maybe none get asked. Don't make a big deal out of it and carry on. Now,
and that's all in a vacuum. But then we could say, but that wasn't the only extension of the declaration, right?
But and you said we get back to it, might as well now. The idea that this is, that there are people in a campaign environment poised to see, any lack of consistency on a position that they don't agree with to begin with as a flip-flop makes you kind of go, who needs that?
Well, this is something I think worth just saying, even more explicitly here, because I think, if you follow this stuff closely, by this stuff I mean just politics generally, you find these moments where you're like, oh my God, I can't believe so-and-so did this. Do you remember when they did this?
Right.
And as someone, again, who studies public opinion, who cares about that? No one.
Right.
You care because you're an activist and you were already going to vote the way you were going to vote regardless.
Right.
Let's just acknowledge that. But the idea that someone's going to come along and say, well, but Abbott's been downplaying the seriousness of the pandemic, and now he's calling it an emergency. Voters will not stand for this. Like,
and if you want to, and if you want to grossly, there's a couple things going on there. There's the cognitive mistake and strategic mistake of, wait till the voters hear about this.
Right.
For Democrats, frankly, how long are you going to think that matters and then make that mistake? But the other thing that's interesting there on in terms of the political notion of this and things that are, maybe by now inevitable but annoying, it's like, I see an opportunity to mobilize motivated reasoning.
Right. And
which is just kind of like, oh, God.
Well, and again, you can't bring up flip-flopping without thinking about John Kerry. But the thing is, I'm sitting here thinking about it and I'm like, setting aside everything else about that campaign and the context and everything, it's like, how many people remember what John Kerry flip-flopped on versus that he was branded a flip-flopper? And that's the point. It's not the thing itself per se. It can matter in the moment, but it's the fact that he got characterized in a way that made him less than trusting generally.
Yeah, and the way that I'm, free associate these things. I know you like.
No.
Josh is like.
It's okay. You're on a microphone.
breathing in deeply. But there is a sense in which, what I'm thinking of, like the birth of political tropes, because you mentioned the mission accomplished thing. In which, the initial thing that triggers the currency or the place in our kind of collective memory of these tropes in our milieu, is very kind of funny, right?
Yeah.
It's like, that mission accomplished thing, like, wait, that was what? The flip-flop thing is like, oh, yeah, that, like, where did that come from?
Right. And the mission accomplished thing is like, and you know what happened? He got reelected.
Right.
Just by the way. So that's the whole thing here is this sort of like high-minded reaction to it. But again, like, and that's kind of what I think is interesting about this whole thing. I mean, again, you've raised it. I've been kind of like, yeah, I think that's interesting. But the more I think about it just from the kind of political dynamics of it, and you think about the people, I think, who listen to this podcast, who follow these things closely, there's a lot of sort of impulses that you could feel about this. And then you say, take a pause, think about the other side. Say, yeah, I could see some different impulses about this. And then you got to step back and say, yeah, but this doesn't matter. So why are we doing this?
Right.
Not us talking about this.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows? But why are we doing this in terms of, why is this part of the strategy? And I think, the point, I think this is where it's good to start talking about the other one, which is the border security declaration, which, again, much more straightforward. It's a major campaign plank. Right. Not renewing it might be taken as seeing that the disaster's over, that Biden's been successful, another possibility once again, right? We know, from just too much public opinion data that we could even just trot out here, that a majority of Republicans in almost every poll that we've, basically ever conducted, except for maybe like right after the pandemic started, finds a majority of Republicans saying that immigration or border security is the most important issue facing the state. We regularly find 2/3 to 3/4 of Republicans in favor of pretty much any effort to either crack down on illegal immigration, illegal immigrants, secure the border. So this is, at least from that side, a no-brainer. Additionally, we know that the Biden administration, there's very negative views towards the Biden administration's handling of immigration and border security here in Texas, as in probably other places. And we have, sort of the consistently high level of apprehensions at the border, or at least border crossings, that have just not abated over multiple administrations at this point. So,
right.
I mean...
Yeah, I mean, nobody should be surprised by this. And the practicalities, here on both of these then. And I think as we move into kind of drawing these things together, and I think this is probably more apparent with the border security thing than it is with the COVID, the subject of COVID and the continuation of executive power in this area. But, one of the consistent themes where there's been, no quote unquote flip-flopping is, the Abbott administration's interest in increasing the leverage of the governor's office within state government. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about that a lot in here, but I think those are both really on display here. As we went on about you unpack the COVID thing to the nth degree. We can talk a lot about the powers, the political reasons here in terms of border security. But ultimately, there has developed in this governor's office, as there did in the last governor's office, a reflexive embrace of maintaining and expanding the authority of the governor's office. And there's a big investment in the authority of the governor's office in the area of border security. Operation Lone Star, is a multi-agency effort led by the governor's office. There's no two ways about that.
Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, I don't want to go off on this tangent because it could be a subject of an entire podcast of its own. I think we've probably talked about this a bit, but I mean, it's hard not to think about, when you say that, it's not hard not to think about that in the context of the expanded powers of the lieutenant governor.
Right.
And especially after this most recent primary season in which, his powers are expected to be even further consolidated in terms of the change in membership. But also what you have with that, based on the public opinion that we've kind of just pointed out, is that, it's not like Patrick can be like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that,
Right.
So ultimately, it makes Patrick slightly subservient to Abbott, at least on the issue that is most important to Republican voters, which is immigration and border security, right?
Yeah. I mean, so I'm writing a note because you're right. In terms of a podcast or, there's a, for a moment, I mean, the teacher part of me was like, oh, that could even be a good essay question for students, compare and contrast the expansion, the increased political power of the governor and the lieutenant governor over the last decade and the different paths to that, right? Because Abbott, I mean, what this underlines is that I think to some degree, and to some degree, this is probably, I'm thinking about this in real time. I'm rolling Josh is watching me look skyward and going, uh-oh. But by the nature of the two offices and the nature of the Texas Constitution, the governor's expansion has been a little more statutory. Not entirely. Some of it has been political and done through, simply declarations and changes of procedure, which is still institutional. Mm-hmm. Where, the lieutenant governor's has been almost exclusively political, right? I mean, Dan Patrick is not,
Right.
other than, but even altering the rules of the Senate, which everybody gets preoccupied with when we change from the fractions needed to move bills and the blocker bill and all that, that's still an internal political move about basically bringing the Senate to heel and creating political conditions in which the Senate becomes subservient to the lieutenant governor. Apologies to any senators listening, but
it's fine. I mean,
certainly the senators of the majority party.
Now we're going down the tangent, but as you're talking about this, it's hard for me to think, and the difference is, if Dan Patrick could basically print up a piece of paper and say, I give myself these powers, he would, but he can't.
let's not
pretend he could. He would. But I mean, it is, that's
so there's an interest. I mean, you kind of, but I think that there's some running to be done with that. But to go back to Governor Abbott's position, I mean, I think to sort of begin to wind these things up, the two things that are common in both of these overall, Governor Abbott has been, and his political team and his advisors, they're cautious and they're calculating. And I don't, I think it's crazy to think that, these two things, these two proclamations get issued without a lot of thought going into it.
Yeah.
And a lot of calculations that, again, I mean, I think, as I was writing this I was writing some notes for this and thinking about it and working on the piece we're working on, I don't want to fall into it's just also political. I mean, when people say that, I'm like, well, yeah, you know what? These guys are professionally, they function in a professional political environment.
very successfully.
So you know what? I mean, if it's not, people that aren't political, show me somebody that's not thinking about politics, and you'll show me somebody that's got a pretty low, low upper bound for what they're going to achieve in politics. Right.
Yeah.
So there's that. So, the governor is very cautious here, and he's interested in the power of the executive branch relative to the other branches. And I think, you raised the point of the ever hovering relationship between the two branches, but also the governor and the lieutenant governor out there, which is partially institutional, but certainly very amped up by the way that the lieutenant governor has occupied the field on that's presented to him with that office.
I want to pivot to something else, bring it back to the political as we wrap this up. But I mean, one of the interesting things I think that kind of discussion raises for me, and you've brought this up before, especially around the context of the Senate, but I think it's becoming more, maybe more salient also around the powers of the governor, which is, is there a point at which there's more pushback, right?
Yeah.
And when I say pushback, I would say within party pushback on sort of granting these powers. I mean, I think,
Well,
we've seen a little bit, we've seen some of it, but the idea, there was. But I mean, even right now, the idea of so how, here's the thing. Let's just, on the border, there is nothing that is going to happen between now and Donald Trump getting reelected president, and even then, I'm not sure that that's going to be the shock that changes, that could allow Abbott to lift this emergency order on the border.
Yeah, we didn't really say that explicitly in the border security piece, but that's exactly right.
It's impossible.
And it's an interesting overarching, I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect unintended consequence of the use of emergency orders for things like this is that, it's a little bit like, the global war on terror, maybe, and things like this where, once you've characterized a crisis a certain way, and then there's been an institutional kind of quasi-statutory response at the national level, open-ended declaration of war by Congress. Right. In this case, these proclamations, then you're in the position of declaring it over and inviting people to render judgment.
I had a professor here at UT, I won't name, in the government department, no reason not to name him. I'll just say who it is. So Bob Luskin.
Yeah.
And we had a good relationship, and we talked about a lot of interesting things. And something that he would say regularly in conversations about politics, and it doesn't matter what the hell you say, well, it's really a continuum, And that's a very Bob thing to say. But the thing about it is, and so what I mean by that is, when you basically say, well, either this is an emergency or it's not, you're in a binary world, you're in a categorization. And honestly, life's usually pretty complicated and not so binary. And I would say that's the same thing with the border. But that, when you're doing using emergency declarations as opposed to statutory language, when you're basically making this kind of open-ended commitment to this thing you've defined as an emergency, but that is also like politically advantageous to you being an emergency, then there's no gain out of it. And there's not a stage 4.
Right.
Or stage 3.
And to go back to the border thing for just a beat, there was also, along those lines, the timing of this was interesting. Last week, the subject of the podcast was the murkiness and the reporting around Operation Lone Star and the increase in enforcement and the increase in spending.
Right.
This declaration came, and I doubt it was causally related, but I also would be surprised in terms of what we said about the Abbott team, that they weren't conscious that this discussion was going on, at least among some corners of the media. That this came out, I think, a day or two after that article came out, and a day or two after, a pickup in coverage of this issue of what is going on and how do we know how effective this enforcement is, et cetera. But, I think I had some of the reporters on that on the podcast. Obviously, I think that's really interesting in a lot of different ways and tells us a lot about this dynamic. But remember, we're also in the seasonal part where, there will be probably an increase.
Yeah,
and we're already, I think there was reporting yesterday that national statistics, national agency tracking came out about increases in movement and apprehension. And it is, again, it's seasonal. We're coming to the point where the border is inevitably going to be an issue again soon. And obviously there's going to be a hair trigger on reporting on this as a problem, or certainly the highlighting of this as a problem within the governor's sort of campaign strategy, right?
Yeah,
and
I think I said this a long time ago, and I think you can look at these two issues and think about this way, which is, this is sort of, I think, the earliest indications of what the pivot is going to look like for Abbott in 2022, right? And it's not going to be a pivot like, hey, open carry, no abortions, whatever, and now we're going to be talking about like public education.
Right.
But in a more narrowly confined space, what you end up with is, the governor has gone and made clear you're not going to, ding him for saying the pandemic's over. As, there was an article in the Houston Chronicle pointing out Abbott's sort of, much more positive language towards renewable energy.
Yeah, talking to a group of corporate business leaders.
Right. Yeah. And so and again, if you want to be a certain kind of person, you're going to say, well, wait a minute. After the
That's not what he was saying right after the blackouts.
And it's like, first of all, remind you can go back, go back in the recording. It doesn't matter. First of all, but what he really does is he removes the criticism. He's going to say, like, all this guy wants to do is drill oil, and look what that's doing. Look at what's going on in Ukraine. Look at what's going on in the world oil markets. Like, this is a problem. He's like, no, I'm pro everything.
Right.
So he takes that off the table, right? And then, when it comes to immigration and border security, it's just a winning issue here because Republicans are in alignment. Independents are mostly with them. And there's a geographic focus to this too, which is, like if you're a Democrat in Dallas or Austin or Houston, you might not be thinking too much about immigration as a major issue facing the state. But it's possible if you're a Democrat living in Laredo, you do.
Yeah.
Especially on the outskirts. And that's where Republicans are pouring resources in to be more competitive. So I said this before all the time, if you're Greg Abbott, you do an emergency declaration, you go down to the border, you put on your fatigues, you're there with the boys, point with the binoculars. That's a message that gets sent throughout the whole state,
right? And
it lands very well.
So in some ways, that's kind of the takeaway from or one of the takeaways from all this is, you take those comments on energy, you take this, and for all the discussion 6 months ago, or in the last year, really, that the Republicans, party in Texas has moved so far to the right. How could Greg Abbott, in any way come back? I think we're beginning to see the exploration of, a general election campaign. Now, look, this is going to be a general election campaign, designed to run from the right.
Yeah.
But, the idea that there's not the latitude to move, a little more in, again, not to the left, but in a slightly leftward direction, there are ways to do that, in which you don't have to abandon the right or alienate the right.
Yeah. And if anything, what he's doing right now, I think, is he is shoring up the center right. You know, so to the extent that there are some Republicans, I think the concern is not so much that how could Greg Abbott win with this? Like, no, Texas is a competitive electoral environment. That's what we know right now. I mean, I think there's no reason to think it's not. Beto O'Rourke is going to give Greg Abbott a challenge because he's a good candidate, and Democrats are not usually in the position.
He's going to have more resources than
Yeah, he's going to have more resources, all those things, blah, 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 right? The state's more competitive, blah, blah, blah. But the point is what Abbott's done kind of, quietly and rather easily is basically gone to, maybe some of the Republicans in the center right of the party, but not the far right, who are a little concerned about, kind of the orientation towards COVID, and said, no, guys, don't worry about it. It's right. You don't need to worry. And the thing is, and we've talked about this a lot before, and the issue is not that those Republicans were going to go and vote for Beto O'Rourke. The issue is that those Republicans weren't going to turn out. Right. And so this is a nice search. We're starting the general election. And the pivot isn't really so much about a major pivot. It's just about taking away some of the kind of obvious arguments.
Yeah, I think discovering this in real time or coming up with a thought in real time. I mean, pivot is almost like the wrong term here, right? It's an appropriate course adjustment, and I'll come up with something catchier than that. Give me some time, but there's this is not like or if it's a pivot, it's like a little pivot.
I think what we say is it's a slight reposition.
Yeah, he's just adjusting his stance a little bit.
It's a slight reposition so that when those inevitable criticisms would have or will come, begin to say, no, I still have an emergency declaration. What are you talking about, right?
Right.
No, I've always said all of the above.
Yeah, we still take this seriously, right? And so and I think that's right. And so to the extent that, you might, there's similarly not that much reason to declare COVID over at this point for him. So we'll have links on the website. We're going to have a piece really about this that should be hopefully up around the time this podcast is up and done. We're pretty close. And a lot of the data we talked about, as always, at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks for listening. Thanks for Josh for being here, coming back. Thanks to our excellent production crew in the audio studio, in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks to you for listening, and we'll be back next week with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.